Hi, I'm Larry Puckett. In my last video, I showed how to use an airbrush to spray paint the track on your layout. So I thought it'd be a good time to follow up with one on choosing an airbrush because, there's different types and they work different ways. So what I'll do today is we'll go over some of the different types that are available and how they work and what to think about when you're picking an airbrush. So let's get started. Now what I want to do is zoom in here because I've got some airbrushes and various parts and things of that nature, accessories laid out here on the top of the module. And we can take a close-in look at all of this stuff, and I'll give you an overview of how it works and what to think about when you're picking your airbrush. Okay, so when it comes to airbrushes, there's two basic classes. There are the external mix and the internal mix. And what that means is that with an external mix, the paint is drawn up into the tip here, and it mixes in the tip with air. And that atomizes it, turns it into a fine spray mist. Whereas with an internal mix, the paint is drawn up through this little opening here into the body of the airbrush itself, and then it mixes internally here and is blown out through the tip as a very fine spray. Now, when I was initially looking for an airbrush back around 1980-81, the general guidelines that I ran across were that because everything happens internally in a internal mix airbrush, it's a much more efficient process. You get much better mixing and atomization of the paint and mixing with the air flowing through here, and it gives you a much finer spray, a much finer surface when you finish. Whereas with the external mix, because everything is happening out here in the tip, it's not as efficient a process and you don't get as good of a spray pattern. Now, so I went ahead and went with internal mix all the way. Now, I know that some folks, like Cody Grivno on the Model Railroader staff, he uses a Pache or Pache external mix airbrush all the time. He uses it for spraying track, he uses it for spraying models and painting them, and I've always felt that he got a very professional looking finish. So I'm not so sure if the old general rule of thumb about internal versus external is still a rule to go by. However, I've always stuck with the internal mix, and I've been very happy with it. But I will tell you that it does take a little bit more work because after you finish spraying, you have to clean all this out. And with an external mix, you're just worried about cleaning the tip and the area where the paint flows through there. Whereas with the internal mix airbrushes, you have to basically take them apart and clean all the components in here. And so that takes a little bit more effort, but I don't know, I've been very happy with my choices. Now this airbrush right here is a Badger Model 200. It is a very good introductory level airbrush in the Badger line. It's internal mix, as you can see here, but it differs in another way. There are also divisions within the internal mix between the single action and double action airbrushes. Now what does that mean? Well, a single action airbrush, you push down on this little button right here and it begins the airflow. However, it also starts the paint flow at the same time. So paint is drawn up from either a bottle of paint set below it or from what's called a little paint cup that can be attached to the bottom. Okay, I don't use this a lot because you have to filter the paint in advance to get any clogs and the like out or sediment, and it's also easy to tip it over. Now you can also, on some types of airbrushes, these paint cups come with little lids that you can use, and I don't know of any for the Badger, but if I ever find one, I'm going to buy it because, these can be convenient when you spray small amounts of paint. Okay, So that's the internal mix single action airbrush. Push on this and the spray starts. Now how do you control the size of the spray pattern? Well, back here on the back there's a little knurled knob, and you can turn that, and by turning it to the right clockwise, it decreases the size of your spray pattern. When you twist counterclockwise to the left, it increases the size, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. Okay, the other type of internal mix is called a double action airbrush, and this is a Badger Model 150, and it is an internal mix, so the paint is drawn up, mixes in here, and is blown out through the tip. And as the same as with the Model 200, on the 150, when you press down, as you can see, the airflow starts. In order to get the paint flow to start, you have to pull back on the button. So if you see how that moves, so at the very beginning, when you press down, all you get is air. And then as you start to pull back with your finger, it does the same thing as twisting that knurled knob on the single action airbrush. So push down for air, pull back for controlling the size of the spray pattern. Now, this can be very difficult to get used to when you're only using it occasionally and when you're new to airbrushing and using this kind of airbrush. For that reason, I don't generally use this one very much. Now this one here, I've had since 1981, I believe, is when I purchased it. And, you know, it has held up very well for a 39-year-old airbrush. You know, there are a few parts in here that I have replaced over time, and I'll tell you some other things about that as we field strip it. But this one here, I picked this up off of eBay about 2-3 years ago because I wanted to get back and have a little bit more control. And I still haven't had a lot of time to experiment and work with it. But, you know, I used it for spray painting some of the track here on the layout in that last video. Now, one other thing right here. If you want to, you can set this up. It's got a little tiny knurled knob right here, and I'll show you that. Okay, so it's right here. And you can turn that, and it basically can allow you to preset the spray pattern, okay? So you can set it so that you have a full-blown spray pattern or just a small one from the get-go. And, you know, that can come in handy too. But you know, if you commit to using one like this, you can get quite good at it. And there are a lot of airbrush artists who use these things and do amazing work with an airbrush. And it basically, one of the things that that some people like about this is when you get ready to start painting, you can turn on the air and basically blow it across your model to blow off any dust that might have settled there. And then you can gradually open up your spray pattern and go from a small to a large amount of paint coming out. So that's one advantage to it. Also, once you're through painting, you can blow on it with air to help dry it a little bit. So those are a couple of tricks that you can use with this that are not available on the other one. Now, on the single action, and this is the one that I use about 99% of the time. And I've used this to paint buildings, I've used it to paint track, I've done scenery work with it, I've painted locomotive models and cars and rolling stock of all kinds. So, you know, it's a very versatile tool. So let me go ahead and take it apart and show you how this works. Get this out of the way here. Okay, so the first thing, let me take the tip off. And there's two parts to this tip. I'm going to zoom in a little bit for this. Okay, there, that's good. Basically, there are two parts to the tip. So first, there is this little part of the tip here that screws out. And then you get to the real meat of the issue here, the real working part. And you can see right in here, there's a small tip. Okay, and that really controls the size of your spray pattern. I'm going to go ahead and take this apart, and you'll see that there's a needle right here, and that's part of the needle valve mechanism. And that needle fits inside of this very, very small tip that I'm showing here, hopefully. Okay, now if you look real close, when I put this all back together, let me get this in here. Okay. If I screw in the needle valve from the rear, you can see just the tip of that needle poking out here. So when that needle is all the way into this little tip here, it reduces the amount of paint flow to 0. And then as I open up this needle valve, then the paint flow is going to increase because we're opening up that little bit of a nozzle, okay? So that's how it controls the flow of paint. All the meantime, it's blowing air through here. And so you can actually twist this and turn it. I typically know what size pattern I'm going to need for a paint job, and I will go ahead and just set this to a certain size of spray and give it a blast on a test piece of cardboard or something, and that gets me to the point. I fine-tune it that way. And then I just use the same spray pattern for most of doing a job, okay? You can stop and give it a twist here and there to adjust the size of your spray pattern while you're actually doing a job. Now, the big advantage, of course, with the double action is, you know, you can go along, you can open up the spray, you can do it actively as you're painting. So it makes for a much faster ability, it gives you a much greater ability to control the amount of spray. Okay, let's go ahead and take this apart and you can see how it works. So I'm going to open this up, take this apart. Okay, so that's the tip. Okay, and then we have the needle. Okay, that comes out by just unscrewing it here from the rear. It slides out. And that's all there is to that. And you can get various sizes of needles for medium and large spray patterns. Okay, I believe that these come with the medium tip and a medium needle. And you have to match the tip to the needle. Now, and then the little control knob or button comes right out. So that's all there is to it. Now you can remove the back here, and that allows you to insert a Q-tip dipped in solvent back in here and clean this out, although that rarely gets dirty and needs any cleaning. And that can go right back together again quite easily. And then as far as the rest of the cleaning goes, so I use a pipe cleaner dipped in alcohol for most of my work. Sometimes if you're using enamels or if you're using lacquers, you will need lacquer thinner or some other type of organic solvent. But at any rate, you can just put it up in here and give it a couple of twists and clean that out fairly well, and then go in from the front here as well and clean it out. And that's all there is to it. Some people feel that by just blowing solvent through here without disassembling it, cleans it out. I don't do that. I never have done it. I always take this apart and keep it good and clean because, you know, that's what keeps it running for 40 years. Okay, now let's look at a couple of other things here. I'm going to put this back together. Okay, here's my tip. Now, I will point out too, I don't know if you can see it, but right here on the base of the threads here, there's this little Teflon gasket, and you know, these things last forever. And I think I've maybe bought 2 in the last 40 years. So you don't, as long as you're careful with them and don't lose them, there's not much that can happen to them. But they're very important because they restrict the airflow or separate the airflow and the paint flow until it gets in there and starts to mix. Okay. So basically then, that just screws back on here like so. And something that comes with with a Badger airbrush is this little wrench, okay? And you can put that on there and give it a twist and tighten it up. Now, then you take the needle valve, whoops, first you put your little push button on first, okay, control knob, and then you can install the needle valve back into its place. Now you'll see that there is a second little knurled knob here behind this one. So the big one is the one that controls, that you turn to control the amount of paint. The small one you can open up, and then you can push or pull on your needle valve to adjust it so that when it's fully inserted, like so, only the very tip of the needle valve is protruding through this small cone-shaped nozzle here. Okay, so that's how you basically set it up so that you get no paint flow at first, and then as you open it up, that needle starts to come back in and it allows more paint to flow out. Okay, now one other thing, this little guy here. Now if you look, you'll see that I've got two different tips here. See if I can get these up in front of you and zoom in just a bit. Okay. The one in my right hand here, you can see it has a flat tip all the way around here on it, whereas this one is serrated. And that's called their crown tip. Now, one thing that happened about 1995 or so is Acuflex acrylic paint came out, and people started using a lot more acrylic paints. And one thing that we found out fairly quickly was acrylic paint tends to dry fairly quickly, and it tends to build up in the tip here. So what Badger came out with was this crown-shaped tip, and it helps to prevent the buildup of the acrylic paint in the tip. And so you don't have to clean it as often. It used to be, when I was using this tip here with acrylic paint, I would have to stop every once in a while and clean it out and get rid of that buildup of acrylic paint that would occur inside of here. Whereas with this tip here, I can go ahead, finish a paint job, and then go ahead and do the cleanup work, because it does a very good job of preventing that buildup. Okay, and these are readily available, and I highly recommend them if you're going to be using a lot of acrylic paint. This one, you can use with enamel and lacquer or whatever. Now, I generally don't use those kinds. The only type of organic-based materials or liquids that I spray would be dull coat and gloss coat, and those are a lacquer. And you have to use lacquer thinner to clean the airbrush afterwards and the like. Now, what about this double action airbrush? Let me zoom out just a little touch here so I can see what I'm doing. Now, this one, as you can see, it's the same type. Matter of fact, these components here are interchangeable on this particular airbrush as well, and I use them interchangeably. Let me take this off, and you can see we have the same needle tip here coming through that controls the amount, and you can see that as I pull back, and you can see here that as I pull back on the control button, this needle is moving. And that's what controls the amount of paint coming out through the nozzle. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult to take apart. You take this blue part off here on the back, and this is where you have your mechanism for the needle valve itself. You can unscrew that. I don't like to unscrew this part because that means taking all of this apart, and it's no fun getting this back together again. So you can see this one, it's a little bit more complicated mechanism. It is spring-loaded in here. It's part of this mechanism, and then it untwists. I'm not going to pull it all the way out, because if I do, then this will come out. So I'm going to put that back in here. But basically, it's the same type of control mechanism. You can twist this little knob loose and extract the control, and extract the needle itself, or adjust the depth of the needle. Okay, to zero it out as well. And other than that, that's all it is to it. I'm going to put it back together here real quick and zero it by pushing it in until it bottoms out, and then I'm going to put my little knurled knob back in place here, and that stabilizes it. Okay, so then we'll be at zero paint. Okay, so let me put this back together because I want to give you a quick little demonstration on how this works. Okay, now, but before I do that, I'll show you a couple of other things that come in handy. Now, I already showed you this the paint cup, and that, like I said, goes here on the bottom. Okay, and you can put paint in here. As air flows through the brush, it pulls paint up from the spray cup or from the paint cup through this set of nested tubes here and into this internal chamber where all the mixing and the like goes on. Now, you can, as I said, just put alcohol in here and spray alcohol or whatever solvent you want to use through the airbrush to clean it out. I do that initially to get the excess paint out, but then I do tear it down and give it a good clean first. Now, let's go ahead. A couple of other things. Now this is some paint that I use for weathering. And what I typically do is, I've got this little stir here that I believe I got from Micromark. I think they still sell it. You know, it operates off of batteries. And you just push this little gray button here, and it turns it on. Okay, and then you can use that to stir your paint. And hopefully you won't get it all over yourself. Now, and that is a lot better way to go about getting your paint ready than shaking it, because when you shake it, you're going to get a lot of air bubbles in there and the whole 9 yards. It's not the best way to go about it. Now, then this is the part that goes onto your bottles. Now, you can use a standard Model Flex paint bottle, or you can buy these glass bottles that Badger sells for your spray paint. And then it's got this lid here that has a good seal on it, and this Teflon dip tube, and that goes down in here. And then this attaches to the bottom of your airbrush, like so. Now, another thing that you can purchase, and I highly recommend it, and I've had this one for many, many years, and it's a little metal screen, okay? And it fits here on the end of that Teflon dip tube. And that fine mesh tends to filter out any sediment and clots that have built up in your paint over time, and it prevents that from clogging your airbrush. So I use these religiously. I have two. I have one of these, like this one here, for my paint, and then I have another one that I just used for dull coat and gloss coat, so that I don't get any stray paint in my dull coat or my gloss coat. Now, there, that's ready to be used. Another thing to be aware of, right here in the top of these caps, there's a little hole right here, so that as paint is drawn out through this tube, air can go in here. And you make sure that that is always kept clean and open, because paint will build up there. You know, this is the original cap that came with my airbrush, and you know, I've been using it for 39 years, so you can keep these things going a long time. So I'm going to put this on here, and I've got some air going down below me, and I'm just going to give you an example of how you can control the spray pattern. Okay, I'm going to start with a little bit of airflow, and then I'll do a fine pattern. Then we'll move over, and we'll go to a slightly broader pattern, heavier. And then over here, I can widen it out a little bit more. And over here, I can really blast it. Okay, so you can start out with a very fine pattern like this one here that is very, very small and very light. You could use that for weathering. And then this, you can go for a little bit more definition, and then broader and very heavy for something like blasting away at spraying the track. This is also why I wear gloves when I do this in most cases. So yeah, get you some disposable plastic gloves and use those when you're doing your painting. And as I said the other day, make sure, get yourself a good particle mask that you can pick up at the hardware store. And those will do a great job of preventing you from breathing in the overspray from any paint jobs that you're doing. Because I'll tell you, it does matter. If you start doing this without a dust mask, after a while you're going to feel like you've been walking through the desert in a sandstorm, because it will get in your lungs and it doesn't feel good. And with something like an enamel or a lacquer and, you know, organic solvent-based paints, you're going to breathe that down into your lungs. You're going to get high as a kite, and you might end up in an emergency room. So I don't recommend doing this without a gas mask or without a particle mask. Also, as we'll talk about, I'll do another video on this in the future on using an airbrush, and in that one we'll go ahead and take a look at spray booths and at masks that are made specifically for use with organic solvents, and we'll take a look at selecting an air pump, because, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to getting into spray painting, because you do need an air source, and I will tell you that the best and cheapest method is just a standard old air compressor that you can pick up at your local Lowe's or Home Depot or Menards or some big box store like that, and they work fairly well, but there are some things you have to do with those as well. And as far as spray booths go, there are some that are commercially available that are not overly expensive, and you can also make your own. I made my own when I first got into this, and I'm still using it today. Well, that's a wrap for today's video. Hopefully the idea of shelling out a lot more money for an airbrush, a paint booth, and a compressor, and various accessories to get you going with spray painting is not going to chase your way from you know, doing some painting in model railroading. Because, you know, it is a very satisfying thing to be able to paint your own models and decal them and the like, and to be able to paint your track inside where you have much greater control over it than doing it outside with a spray can and just blasting away. So, have a good week, and we'll see you here on Friday with another video. This time we're going to be taking a look at some other project here on the modules. So, have a good one. Bye now.